Welcome back to the channel. This is Chris Morrison, and what I want to do is continue our conversation on the problem of evil. In fact, we've been having a lot of conversations about the problem of evil, so I've decided to put all these into a playlist. You can check the link in the description below. Now, in the last video, what we did was we looked at the question of God's omnipotence, which is to say his power, and we asked, do we need to redefine God's omnipotence to explain the problem of evil? And of course, I suggested that if we understand omnipotence correctly, that we don't need to, and it actually doesn't help us very much with the problem of evil at all. At the same time, I also noted that very often what people are concerned about with omnipotence is omnipotence a relationship to freedom. So I want to ask you what I think is a pretty straightforward question, which is that if humans really have true free will, if they really are free, would that limit God's power? There's an argument that it would. It goes something like this. If people have free will, then they can choose either good or evil. So, they have a choice which road they can go, right? Now, the reason we think that is because free will seems to mean, by definition, the ability to choose between two or more alternatives. And clearly the alternative to good is just evil. So it would seem that if we have free will, we can choose between good or choose evil. So it would seem then that if people can't choose evil, then all that's left is for them to choose good. Well, that's not an alternative. Therefore, they don't actually have free will. And therefore, if God is the one preventing us from choosing evil, then he's either not really given us free will in the first place, that's all illusion, or he's negated free will so that, yeah, in theory, you could commit it, but commit evil, choose evil, but I keep putting blocks in your way so that you never actually choose evil. Well, then really, there may be a theoretical sense you have free will, but all of a sudden it doesn't count. You don't actually have free will anymore. So if we are going to be very serious about the claim that humans have free will, they can choose good or evil, that would seem to entail that God's power over human action is limited. He can't force you to choose evil. He can't force you to love him, for instance, because then it wouldn't be real love. If he forced you to choose good, it wouldn't really be good. So you can imagine this is a pretty convenient argument for apologists to make, because now we can say that if God wants to create free agents, he's basically stuck with the fact that some of these free agents have the ability to choose evil outcomes, and therefore a perfectly powerful, loving, God, good, all-knowing God is consistent with the presence of evil in the world. In fact, you might say it would be logically contradictory for God to create free creatures, but then also insists they never choose evil. Now, attractive as this argument is, I think there's an important counter argument that we need to consider. And this counter argument, by the way, is not an argument that atheists or non-believers will typically make. This is an argument that roots very deeply in Christianity itself, and it's something I think that we need to consider because it gets us a whole lot further along on what we mean by free will. And the argument goes something like this. First of all, the alternative to good is not, in fact, evil. The alternative to good is rather other goods. You can choose A or you can choose B, where both options are good. We actually never will or choose evil for its own sake. No one ever actually says, I'm just going to do this because it's evil. What we do, we choose all sorts of things that turn out to be evil. So don't turn off the video just yet. We all choose things that turn out to be evil from time to time, but we always choose this or that because we're after some sort of good. If I can use a movie reference, Thanos' snap, right? Terribly evil thing, but who's after a good. And in fact, one of the things that makes really compelling storytelling is when you can kind of see what is it that the villain is after? What good is he after? And while that makes sense on the surface, you may say, but wait a minute, Chris, there are clearly people who choose to do evil things knowing full well that they're evil. And what I would say here is that if anytime we will an evil, it's always as a result of a defect. And the reason it's a defect is because, as we've said previously, evil is simply the absence of a good that ought to be there. It ought to be there according to its nature. And let me explain a little more what I mean by that. There's actually two kind of defects that may result in our willing of evil. The first is a defect in our understanding. Here we think something is good. We truly have the best of intentions, but it's turned out that we're just wrong. We're not God. We make mistakes. So we intend the good, but for various reasons, we misjudge the situation and turned out to do something harmful or evil or bad. We have all been in situations you want to do the right thing, and then just because you misread the situation, you end up doing the wrong thing. That can happen. It's an evil out of ignorance, if you will. But I don't think that bothers people as much as the second kind of defect, which is a defect of the desire itself. Here, we are willing something that actually is of itself properly evil. Say, for example, I want to harm another person. That's going to be evil. You say, well, Chris, you just said you don't will evil, and now we're saying we do. So what do we mean? What I mean is that sometimes our what we will is rooted in a disordered desire. Now, this is where you have to be careful. The thing willed, the underlying desire, what you want is still a good. But and however, what happens is the desire, because it's disordered, ends up perverting that good. So, for example, let's take someone who wills revenge, and therefore I'm going to hurt this person because I want revenge. That's clearly disordered and evil. However, what revenge is just disordered justice. Justice is a good thing, yet when it's taken the wrong way and it's perverted, it becomes revenge, and that is evil. Greed, for example. Greed is obviously an evil thing, but it's evil because it's disordered. The way is good, and what greed is actually trying to get at, which is a good thing, is desire to have what we want. If I see something and I desire it because it's good for me, more money. Money can be good for me. It can allow me to buy the things that I need, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting money. There's nothing wrong with wanting food or wanting health, all those sorts of things. But then when I want it to a degree that it is harmful to others and it causes me to trample others, or I think that that is what's going to get me happiness, well, that becomes greed. And now it's the desire that is disordered. As a quick aside, an interesting way you may want to study this further is if you read Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. There's a chapter in there where he discusses how difficult it is for evil, say Satan, his minions, to be able to come up with virtues of their own. They find out that every single thing that they try to come up with, every evil they tried, is actually presumes a certain good. And I think that's deeply true. Every evil thing is actually some sort of good that has already been perverted. So the good already exists, but it lacks something that it's supposed to have, which is why it turns out to be evil. So whenever we will something, we are always willing something that is itself good, but because of either a defect in our intellect or a defect in our want or our desire, if you will, what happens is we end up committing an evil. Now, if you feel like this is a bit philosophical and entirely unhelpful, let me immediately say this is extremely helpful, because if it were true that there are no defects, let's say you had a person, hint, hint, with no defects whatsoever, a truly perfect person, this would be a person who understood the situation perfectly. This would be a person whose desires were always perfectly ordered. Then that person would always desire true good. They would never have any desire for an evil, and therefore would never sin. And yet this person would not be less free. This person would be more free. On this view that I'm discussing here, a truly free person is not going to desire evil, because a desiring evil is actually a limitation on your freedom. It's that I'm desiring a good thing, but because of a limitation on my part, I'm desiring something that in fact is not a true good. So what kind of people might this be? Well, of course, we start with God, but even as Christians, we say that Jesus is perfect, and so he would be just this kind of person. So this gets into theological explanations of what we mean by Jesus is impassible. The angels who have been confirmed in righteousness, or even, and this is important, the saints in heaven. How is it that when you go to heaven that you maintain your freedom, and in the eternal life you're going to have free will? If free will is the ability to choose evil, and we say that saints in heaven are perfectly free, then how do you maintain that the saints in heaven are free if they can never choose evil? That argument simply doesn't work. You need a way to explain what free will is without requiring the ability to choose evil. And in fact, as we've seen, there is no reason to require people to choose evil. Free will, properly understood, is the ability to choose between this good or that good. That's the alternatives that we get to choose between. So now you say, great, Chris, that's interesting. I've learned something about free will. What does this have to do with God's power or the problem of evil? And it's simply this: there is no necessity on God's part to allow us to choose evil. But, and however, if the defects in us are real, then the free choice argument takes on a new meaning and actually works in its own way. I do, in fact, have defects. And unless God is going to intervene every single time I can make a mistake in thought or every single time I make a mistake in desire, if he's not going to intervene every single time, then in fact, I am going to be quote unquote free to make some of those wrong choices, because what's happening is I'm tempting to choose between two goods and I make the wrong choice. Seen this way, the reason that God allows evil is because he's not constantly perfecting every single person. And the request, I think, for God to always be intervening to make people perfect seems a bit unnecessary. And in fact, it is unnecessary. What we can say is that God and his omnipotence and omniscience and goodness can allow for those defects. There's no reason that God has to, but this is going to recontextualize the question and say, well, how is it that a perfectly good, perfectly powerful, perfectly knowing God would allow for such defects? That's a little different question than the way it's traditionally asked. And I think that's one that we can make some real progress. What it means is that the problem has been answered at the level of freedom, but it's just going to push it back another level. And we're going to have some conversations on that. This is going to leave unresolved what's called the issue of divine contingency. We'll get into that in some details in the next two videos, but it basically on the knowledge side of things would imply that God's knowledge of the future would guarantee, you might call theological fatalism or determinism. And then the issue of his own power, whether or not he's contingent on us. As we answer this question of freedom, recognizing it's choosing between A and B, that helps us, but we have to do a little more work to understand it more at the depths. And we'll continue that in the next two videos. Until then, leave your questions, comments, cries of outrage below. And until the next time we see each other, may God richly bless you.